evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Mahoning Drive-In Theater, the largest single-screen drive-in in the United States. We're certainly glad you could be with us this evening, and don't forget the concession stand is open with all kinds of great things to eat and drink.
89.3 Mahoning Drive-In Radio, your old friend Virgil back once again for another exciting episode of the podcast. As you guys know, the only podcast dedicated to the revival of our beloved drive-in culture. And man, oh man, we've been so lucky to have an incredible lineup of drive-in owners, celebrities, artists, filmmakers come onto the show and talk about their love and passion of the American staple that's been inspiring us for generations. And faced with hurdle after hurdle, it seems to be having a bit of a revival. But in the 80s, the multiplex boom was really a big reason why so many drive-ins became forgotten, abandoned, sold. And today, we are blessed to welcome documentarian Jan Krawitz, director of Drive-In Blues from 1986, which really catches a pivotal turning point for the drive-in landscape. So let's welcome Jan. Welcome. Thanks for making the time.
Thanks. I'm happy to meet you both virtually and to be on the show. Thanks so much.
So why don't we jump right into it? 1986 was certainly a different time for the drive-in culture. And as we talked about, many ups and downs during the drive-in heyday, but the 80s was really a shift. So why don't you talk about what led to wanting to make this documentary, Drive-In Blues?
Sure. So I'd love to say I was conceived in a drive-in or I grew up going to drive-ins, but none of those things are true. My childhood relationship to drive-ins was I grew up in Philadelphia and my grandmother lived in Atlantic City. And between Atlantic City and Philadelphia, there were probably 2 or 3 drive-ins still running. And every time we would go visit her, which was about once a month, and we'd drive home in the evening and you would, see the movies going by on the side of the road. And my sister and I would beg my father to get a flat tire right in front of one of the drive-ins so we could watch the screen. And of course, it never happened. So in fact, the first time I ever went to a drive-in was after my senior year in high school. I spent the summer in California, sort of in a Habitat for Humanity, before there was Habitat for Humanity, building houses in a small farm community. And they had a local drive-in. It was in the San Joaquin Valley. There was $1 a car night. And one of the people leading this group of teenagers had an open, Scout. So it was like an open backed Jeep. And so about 10 of us would pile in, and that was my first experience actually going to a drive-in. Yeah, so that was really fun. And then I didn't go again, and then I, became a filmmaker, and I was living in Austin, teaching at UT Austin in the film program. And, again, my joke about Austin is, since it's in the center of the state, no matter which direction you drive to get out of Texas, it takes a day. So, I moved there in 1980, and by 1983 or 84, I had driven out of Texas in many directions. And I started seeing, what I consider America's answer to Stonehenge, these sort of abandoned drive-in screens looming, and particularly in West Texas, it's so flat, and you would see these things, 20 miles away. And so it was really like a visual prompt to get me curious about, why are all these drive-ins abandoned? Because it wasn't really something that I knew much about the industry or knew that the heyday had been in 1957 and that, as you said, the 80s were a sort of, bleak period. But I did get intrigued. So I started doing some research. And again, this is pre-internet, and doing research in pre-internet days was quite laborious, and you had to be pretty creative. Right. So the first thing I did was I thought, well, where are the drive-ins and how many are there? And I hooked up with the National Association of Theater Owners and asked if they had a list of just drive-ins, and they didn't. So I actually went to the Austin Public Library and went through all the phone books and just started, sending letters through the mail to all of the addresses that I could find there. And that was the start of my research. And about half of the letters came back handwritten with like blew away in a hurricane or no longer here. And yeah, you'll appreciate that, right? So for a while I thought, oh my gosh, this could be a 2-minute movie. I'll just pan over all of these returned mail, and that will be the epilogue for the drive-in. So that's my research, my sort of research story. It was really sort of crazy. And that's when I realized, obviously, when I did more research, that they were, dying out.
Yeah. When you set out to make it, were you trying to kind of keep it localized? Were the drive-ins that you visited in the Texas area, or did you really spread?
Well, yeah, that's a great question. So the next step of my research was actually to figure out, well, where are the living drive-ins, right? And what's unique about some of them? So again, because I was at UT, there was, this mass of undergraduates. I think at that time, 94% of UT undergraduates were from Texas. So I had a colleague who was teaching like an intro to film course. And I said, can I come to your class and do a, written survey? And he's sure. So I went to his class and I just got up in front of 500 students. And I said, I'm thinking about making a film about drive-ins. And here's a questionnaire. Can you tell me about drive-ins that you know and love in your hometown or elsewhere? And so it was just this bounty of information, and like a number of people would write Monday night at the Gemini, you've got to go to Monday night at the Gemini in Dallas. And, other people would just talk about the small town they grew up in. And so it was really just this wonderful font of information with details. I asked them for details. And so based on that, I got a big map of Texas and, sort of circled, highlighted all of these towns. And then I contacted a bunch of the owners. And yeah, it was pretty localized. I mean, I did make a foray into Colorado. There's that one scene in there, as you know, where that man built a motel. It's in Monte Vista, Colorado. And Mr. Kelloff built a motel where you can stay in a
Such a cool idea.
Yeah.
That's our dream. We always joke that we would so do that if we had unlimited funds.
Right. And also the climate there. His wasn't open all year round either, but and he tells that story in the film, of course, of how it was such an incidental thing because he and his wife had to when their house was being refurbed or something, they had to stay in the projection booth. And he thought, what a great idea. So,
sounds familiar. Nothing like
it was just happenstance that he came up with that idea. So I did shoot there. And then the one other out of state shoot was I did write to, well, at the time, actually, I had a graduate student who was a projectionist at a drive-in in Austin. So I went with him one night just to sort of see what's it like from the projection booth and, what's the whole scene. And I sat there for about 4 hours because it was a double feature. And I started looking through, there were magazines there, that theater owners subscribe to, that have concession advertisements and things like that. And one of the ads was for screen building. So I thought, oh, well, that would be a great idea. So I took names of like 3 or 4 companies that supposedly built screens. Now I should add, these magazines were quite old,
right. At some time they built screens.
Right. So I wrote to like probably 3 or 4 companies. And the one that wrote back said, lady, what's wrong with you? We haven't built a screen in, I don't know how many years. He said, all we do is tear them down. And I thought, oh, well, that sounds pretty visual. So it was a company in Ohio. And I kept in touch with him. And I said, could you just let me know when you're going to be tearing one down? And it took a couple months, but then he did call me with very little notice that he was tearing one down in, actually 2. You can see that in the film, in Waterbury, Connecticut. But the interesting thing about that, so the site was being turned into condos, which I think is pretty typical. And they actually repurposed, they tried to pull them down carefully, and they repurposed the metal, strips that comprise the screen, and they got moved to another location in Connecticut, Mansfield, Connecticut, where the owner was multiplying. He was, as you said, the multiplex was starting to really kill.
Oh yeah, so he was adding screens. Yeah.
Right. So you see that scene, where towards the end of the film where he's actually building a screen. And so he went from like 1 screen to 3. So that was a real coup, because obviously you can talk about, well, these owners talk about, the driving is dying out and this will be our last summer, but to actually see, this like behemoth come crashing to the ground, I thought was, from a filmmaking point of view.
Visual. Oh my goodness.
Yes, it was a real coup.
Yeah, somebody who runs a drive-in, it's the ultimate visual and nightmare scene.
Exactly. Yeah. And of course, from a structural point of view, the minute I filmed that, I thought, oh, well, there's my ending. Of course, there's my ending. But, once I started editing the film, it seemed like, no, that's not where I want to end it. And so it's actually the opening scene in the film because, you have to hook the audience. I mean, a lot of the people, I show it as a work in progress to a few people as I'm working on the film. And I realized that people didn't even know why they should care or that they're drying out. And, rather than resort to text, which I'm always loath to do, saying, the heyday of the drive-in was 1957 when there were 4,000 drive-ins, and today there's, it's like just to show that visually is a much more filmic and cinematic way to hook the audience. And then they get curious. It's like, oh, why are they tearing down a drive-in screen? And that was the great thing about shooting in Texas. I also asked these students in the survey, are there abandoned drive-ins in your hometown? And so I also, circled those on my map because I was really interested in doing a lyrical sequence, which I have at the end, of, drive-ins that were lying fallow in the landscape, which, in the Northeast would never happen, or in California would never happen because the real estate was too expensive. So it was only in Texas that they would go out of business. And because they were, they were built 15 miles, the towns were laid out on a grid system in West Texas, 30 miles apart. So the drive-in would be midway. They would be 15 miles from nowhere, right? From either town. And so when they went out of business, that they did very rarely would that land be developed back then. I'm sure things have changed, in the 30 years since I shot the film, 40 years now almost.
Yeah. And that was common back in the day when screens were brought down, that others that were developing into multi screens and adding screens to their property, they'd try to work out deals with other owners to save on that cost, But you said it, as far as just people not realizing that it's something that's going away and not realizing that every choice that they make to go to the multiplex is the hit to the drive-in that used to get patronized every single weekend. And ironically, Mark, you discovered this documentary. Why don't you tell people where you discovered it? And it kind of sparked your interest in drive-ins again.
Yeah, I was thinking about that just I think yesterday when we were preparing to do this interview. Is I first saw Drive-In Blues. It had to have been, I want to say, somewhere around 89, 1990, and it aired on Discovery Channel, Discovery Sunday, they called it. And I saw something called Drive-In Blues. I had a drive-in in my hometown. It had closed in the scheme of things not long before I watched this film. But as a kid, time is much more expansive. So it seemed like forever ago that I'd seen a drive-in, but I was curious and I watched it, and it just hooked me from that opening. That screen falling down, that older gentleman in the baseball cap talking about, bemoaning the state of drive-ins, that they're all going away. And it really got me to think again about how much I loved going to the drive-in as a kid. And it wouldn't have been for another probably 5 or 6 years until I moved to go to college, and luckily had 2 drive-ins about 45 minutes away in 2 directions from where I lived, that I started going again. And that fueled my fire. And that's why I am doing what I do right now, general manager of the Mahoning. So thank you for making that film, because indirectly you might be the reason why I'm doing this podcast right now.
Well, that's very cool. That's why I make films. And I always regard filmmaking as sort of a tree falling in a forest enterprise, because until I just engage with you, I never really, or very rarely do I know how my films touch people or influence people or change their worldview. And it's just sort of on a wing and a prayer. I just have to assume that in some way they do. And that's what keeps me going from one film to the next. So that's really gratifying to hear that anecdote. Thanks for sharing it.
Oh, happy to. And when you shot the film, how far and wide did you travel to capture the various drive-ins and owners on film?
Well, yeah, actually, I looked up in my notes, and we actually traveled 5,000 miles over 5 weeks.
Wow.
Not including the Connecticut was obviously a flight because I was living in Texas then. But it was a lot because, obviously Texas is pretty big. But the cool thing about, as assiduous as I was with my pre-production research and my highlighted map and all of that, the great thing was that when we were driving around, we would sometimes just come upon abandoned drive-ins.
Well, here's another one. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And you could see them like, 10 miles in the distance. It's like, oh, wow, there's one. And, the great thing, the two happy accidents that are in the film in terms of imagery are there's two junkyards, like drive-in lots that have been repurposed as junkyards.
Yes,
Like,
yeah.
who could conceive of that? When I first showed the film, I premiered it at UT, and someone in the audience said to me, wow, how did you set up that shot with all those abandoned cars in the drive-in? And I
Quite
said,
production
well,
value, right?
right.
Up
I
a
don't know
tripod
what
is
kind
what I
of
did.
budget you think I had, but and the great thing about that one, it was in East Texas. We were just driving to a drive-in Longview, a living drive-in, and we happened upon that one. It was a Sunday, and so nobody was there. I mean, we couldn't get permission to film there, but it was this huge lot. The screen was still there, and all the cars were parked facing away from the screen, which I just thought was
what a
such
visual,
a great
yeah.
metaphor. So we had to, of course, sneak in to do a little bit of shooting, and that shot actually has become like the still that I use for the production still for the film, because it is such a great metaphor for really what the film is about, which is, as I say in the synopsis, lamenting. It's like celebrating its heyday and lamenting its decline.
Totally. And in a weird way, again, we've been blessed with having guests flock to the podcast, and we had Al Minnelli, who directed At the Drive-In. We had April Wright, who directed Going Attractions. And now with you, we're kind of going across multiple eras of documentary filmmaking focused on drive-ins.
Yeah. And I actually, the first thing I always do when I set out to make a film is like, is there space for this film? Are there 3 documentaries out there already on drive-ins? And at the time I made the film, there were none.
Yeah.
And, another thing that I forgot to mention, like in terms of my personal experience with drive-ins, I forgot to mention another pretty seminal one, which was when I was in graduate school studying to be a filmmaker. I went to visit my sister who lived in Virginia, and we went to a drive-in. And we saw that film, I think it's just called Drive-In, where a sniper gets
Oh my gosh, how perfect.
That's Targets with Boris Karloff. It was
Targets, that's exactly right.
Yeah, excellent.
Yes.
Perfect drive-in movie.
Right, he carves a little holes, in the screen, and then he gets up there and starts picking people off in the drive-in.
Oh, yeah.
It was such a crazy film to see in a drive-in, and I think I really suppressed that whole experience.
That'll burn into your skull.
Yeah, so when I was making the film, of course, there's always this temptation to use like a Hollywood film like that, but of course I never had the budget. And so the one thing that I got really lucky with were the trailers. I mean, I did connect with a lot of collectors, like old time projectionists who had kept the teasers,
beautiful
and the trailers.
snipes. Yeah.
And every drive-in I went to, I would say to them, oh, do you have anything lying around in your projection booth? And, like in one particular drive-in, they sent me out to the barn, and there was just stacks of 35 millimeter cans,
what a
completely
dream.
Molted. They had gotten wet. The emulsion was sticking to itself. I mean, none of it was usable. They said, take what you want. So I did. But it turns out that none of it was usable. But then, when I got back to Austin, I did some word of mouth. I did some advertising in Big Reel. And I definitely was able to find, there's that one, it's like your handicapped.
The Lover? Oh, yeah.
Friends. Oh, yeah. No, the Lover one, I actually did buy that from Filmax Studios.
I want that so badly. When I saw it, I was like, that needs to be on the Mahoning screen. Hey, Love Bug.
Yeah, a couple of them I knew I wanted, like the Welcome to the Drive-In and the speaker one. I actually did purchase them and license them from Filmax Studios, which makes trailers. But there were some definitely unique ones that were like one-offs, like just a particular drive-in. It was called a shut-in pass. That's the one where it says, take your friends who otherwise couldn't sit in an ordinary movie seat.
Yeah.
I mean, and that one, just one of the owners that I filmed just, gave it to me. And like, he didn't even know what he had anymore in the projection booth. So They were all, of course, 35 millimeters. So I got back to Austin, and I had to, sort of adapt the editing machine I was working on to 35 so I could look at them. And then I have them reduced to 16 millimeter, which is the gauge that the film was shot in. But yeah, there were some real gems there. And then I met a projectionist. Someone told me about a projectionist in Dallas. So I went up to visit him. And he had his garage set up as like a screening room with like changeover and everything. He had like two projectors, movie seats. So he was the one who gave me some of those teasers that are just those little silent ones that, you know, like Teenage Doll.
Good. I mean, those are the things that, you know, fans of the drive-in flock to. And shout out to Robbie Mack and Phil Mack. We love them. So obviously this was like you said, a turning point for the drive-in, kind of a bleak time for the drive-in. What was the mood of some of the owners when you did the documentary? Was it real doom and gloom for them, or did some have that I'm going to keep pushing mentality?
Well, you know, that's a great question because, you know, as a filmmaker, I always like something attracts me to the idea. And I sort of had this like romantic notion of, oh, here's this uniquely American institution that's dying out, and what is being lost here, and why do we have no, you know, sort of cultural loyalty? Like, you know, why is everything so disposable in American culture? Like, why isn't this something that's being saved in any particular way? So I sort of thought when I would meet these, I specifically limited myself, well, almost to mom and pop drive-ins, like people who only owned one drive-in. I wasn't really interested in going to the big corporate ones, although I did film at the I-45 in Houston because of just what the scene was. And obviously that was a big multiplex. But generally I wanted people who this had been their livelihood, you know, and that they would have, I thought, again, this is, you know, me before I really met the people, I thought that they would be wistful about what will be lost if and when their drive-in would close. And frankly, what I found was it was really all about economics. And you know, they lamented the loss of business, but more because it was their livelihood, not because of any, you know, sort of cultural nostalgia or anything like that. So, yeah, I think you can see that at least two owners said this will be our last season, and it was. And that was Mr. Stone, the guy that you mentioned, who's in one of the opening interviews, the guy who lived in his screen.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. He lived in the screen.
Yeah, you know, there were two drive-ins that I found like that, where they built an apartment into the screen tower
structure. Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, it was really hard to depict. I mean, that was the thing about making the film. You know, there just somehow the sense of scale and everything was a little bit hard to capture on film. And so when you went in his apartment, it didn't really look any, you know, particularly unique. So it was a little hard he just describes it, but you don't really get a sense of it. But anyway, he lasted for another 2 or 3 years. And, you know, he was trying all kinds of things. Like the first night we got there, I had only talked to him on the phone. And then we drove out there. He was in West Texas. The town was maybe Stanford, Texas, something like that. And we got there, and the marquee, there was like a XXX movie playing. And I was like, oh my gosh, you know.
What type of crowd am I getting here?
Yeah, he never mentioned that he was showing porn at this theater. And so we got there before he wasn't around, and then he shows up. It was still daytime, and we were planning to film.
Hey, welcome.
Right. And I said, wow, you know, like, I didn't know that you were showing X-rated films here. And he said, oh, I only do that during the week. Like, it's a family business on the weekend. And fortunately, I think we got there on a Thursday. So I said, okay, then, you know, tonight I'll just hang out and sort of watch, you know, how you open and you know, snack bar and all of that. So
and nobody wants to be filmed.
Well, right, exactly. So, you know, sunset happens, and then all of a sudden, like, there's a line of like pickup trucks with like single guys in every pickup truck. I mean, it was just, and so, you know, and so he's in the ticket booth. Mr. Stone is in the ticket booth, and, you know, and he's the one in the film who says he has the largest screen in West Texas. It's like 50 feet high and 84 feet wide. Yep. And I'm sitting there like, you know, chatting with him, whereas behind his head, all these incredible things were going on. Wide.
Keep that blur perfectly.
Frame it.
Yeah. And I'm trying to be like nonchalant, but as he promised, the next night it was filled with families, and that's when we filmed.
Oh, that's amazing. And that was, again, very regular at that time when drive-ins were truly challenged. They were looking for anything that they could do to pull in audiences, and that was a niche back then, pre-internet. You know,
exactly.
You were offering a service, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. So his lasted, to get back to, you know, how did they feel about it? His lasted another couple of years, but you can tell in the film that he's he's definitely wistful. He's the one who says at the end, they'll be mostly left for nostalgia. I presume the days of the drive-in are numbered very close, very bad. And then the other man who ran it with his mother, she said, this is going to be our last summer because you can't stay in something if you're losing money. And in fact, it was their last summer. So
yeah, was she the one who said that it changed overnight for them?
Yes.
That one summer?
Yeah.
Exactly. And yet that you really feel that. You really feel for them. That's a family that, was running a successful business for years and had the ingenuity and passion to do it. And again, overnight for them, audiences just decided to make their way to the air-conditioned indoors and forget about their hometown drive-ins. And that was the case for sure with my hometown. You felt the hit in the 80s and leading right into the 90s, and they puttered along until they eventually closed.
Yeah. And people also attributed it, some of the owners, because I would always ask that question, some of them attributed to the cars being smaller and less comfortable, like during the gas crisis.
Right.
What other, cable TV they point to.
Oh, yeah.
It was sort of a, perfect storm kind of thing. I think it wasn't just a single contributing factor that caused them to, and, as the man at the end who talks about doing multiple screens, he says, without the multiple screens, you lose your audience to the multiplexes because they can't compete and get the first run films because they can't keep them there for long enough.
Yeah. And that's the hard thing is, it really shifted again, kind of overnight as the industry began to grow. And I point to, you're right, there's so many factors that go into it. But I always point to that time, like late 80s into the 90s as the multiplex boom. And I think about, because my hometown drive-in suffered, that was the time that the drive-ins really were just like kapoof and took that huge hit. But I think the number that I remember was 2,000 screens. And this is AMC, who I worked for at one time, 2,000 screens in 1988, but it exploded to the highest was 37,000 in the United States. So talk about, talk about a flooding of the market in a short period of time and, changing the landscape. And also movies changed as well. The big summer blockbusters and things like that kind of begged for the surround sound and the new technologies. So,
well, the question, can I ask you both a question? Because I just read recently that the states with the most drive-ins are New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. And that so surprised me because the climate is obviously not as accommodating as in the Southwest or California. So do you have any explanation for that?
It's strange. We're blessed in our state and on the East Coast in general to have such a strong kind of drive-in presence still. I think, honestly, a lot of it has to do with the locations of some of these drive-ins. They're still in areas that aren't insanely developed. I mean, our area is developed, but we are in an area that's, it's a really small town. So I think it might also have a lot to do with that and the history of it as well, where our state's the home of the oldest drive-in in the country with Shankweiler's. So that might have something to do with the pulse. But Mark, am I wrong in saying I believe 27 drive-ins in Pennsylvania?
I don't know the exact number, but there are quite a few, and they all do seem to be set apart from where development is. And the ones that I've visited at least seem to be not terribly close to indoor theaters, where the drive-in still is the main way people see movies outside the home.
The hometown appeal.
In our case, we have an 8-screen multiplex right up the street from us, and we have another drive-in 15 minutes away. But what we do is so different from everybody else now. It sets us apart from everybody. But yeah, I do feel quite lucky now to be living in New York, where there are several, but they're more upstate and rural, and in Pennsylvania where it's great how many there are.
Yeah,
and actually, to get back to that earlier question, when you said, did I limit my where I shot? Of course, I also shot at Shankweiler's in Orfield, Pennsylvania. Once
right down the road from us, baby.
Yeah, I know. And, once my research told me that they were the oldest drive-in, because of course the Camden drive-in had closed, many years earlier. So they were really accommodating the owners, and I think they're still in business, aren't they?
Yep. Mm-hmm. The downside is, I don't know what it was like when you visited in the 80s, but my whole experience is going there is it's developed fully around it, and now it seems like it's in the middle of a neighborhood almost. Their back
Yes, it was
lot
like
is
that
housing.
then.
Yeah.
You can see that in the film, actually. There is one scene of like at dusk, and there's people. You can sort of tell it's not Texas, and I do remember that it was really weird.
Neighbors right there.
Right, and it's a pretty small lot too. So
Yeah.
there was definitely. I remember at least on one edge, like suburbia came right up to the edge of it.
It's nuts. And I was always jealous of those people who lived right there. I was like, wouldn't that be the coolest ever? You're just like, come over for a sleepover. We're watching another drive-in movie. So why don't we take a step back a little bit? Where does this fall in your timeline as far as becoming a documentary filmmaker, and what led you on that path to become a filmmaker?
Well, it's funny. I always was, as a kid growing up in the 50s and 60s, when I used to go to the movies, it's very weird, but like the newsreel was my favorite thing, like not the cartoons and not the pictures, but I totally loved the newsreels. And I never, the newsreels obviously existed in movies until 1966 when TV news came in. And that totally precipitated the demise of newsreels, which to this day, I still miss them. So that's just, in the back pocket there. Like I never really consciously thought about,
but the seed was planted young.
Filmmaking, right? But then I went off to college, and I had an opportunity to make a little like 8mm movie when I was in high school. I just went to a public high school in Philadelphia, and there was, just an 8mm camera sitting around in this graphic arts class I took. And I really enjoyed that. And then I went off to college and thought I'd be a social worker. And then, somehow dropped out for a while, came back and realized that, wait a minute, I don't want to be a social worker, but I do want to do good things in the world. And documentary, just somehow it all fit into place that I could be sort of, pursue this love of film that I had. And even my freshman year in college, I took a course in like documentary, studies, like looking at films. And so I was always attracted to documentary. I never saw it as a means to an end being narrative film. To this day, I love narrative films to watch, but it's not something I ever wanted to do. So then I ended up majoring in film and photography in college and went to grad school at Temple and got my MFA. And at that time, it was just a documentary program. So I really was like, sort of straight and narrow, like this is what I wanted to do. And that's when I started thinking about like the newsreel and how much I loved them. And, in some of my films, I have worked a lot with archival footage. And actually, the project I'm working on now is 100% archival. So I'm always still really attracted to a lot of that material. And you can see, obviously, there's archival in Drive-In Blues as well. Yeah. So the great thing about my career is that I've been teaching full time since I graduated with my graduate degree. And that has enabled me to basically do passion projects, that I only make films about things I care about. They're not sponsored films. They're not commissioned films. I make them artistically in the way that I want, and I have complete creative autonomy. And then after the fact, I've been really lucky because about 5 of my films have been on national PBS, Discovery, some international television, have had distribution through various venues. So it's been the subject matter of my films are pretty eclectic. I mean, the drive-in
wide range for sure. It's not like you're the drive-in girl or anything. It's,
no.
You're all over the place.
Yeah, and it's just whatever happens to attract me at a particular time. I think thematically, you can't look at the work and say, oh, I'm interested in, I'm not Ken Burns always making historical films, or I'm not, making political films or advocacy films. I mean, I think I make films about people and, films that aren't topical in terms of if they take me 4 years to make, they're going to be just as valuable, hopefully, in this case, in 35 years. And so, 2 of my films made 20 years apart are about little people. And that's the only time I ever went back and revisited a subject. And when I first made Little People, which was a co-direction, came out in 1982, I never imagined that I would follow up with these same people 20 years later, but for a number of reasons, I decided to do that. And so in 2004, a second film about some of the people who appeared in Little People came out, and that's a film called Big Enough.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
A follow up, so you go back and visit the subjects in the first movie.
Yeah, and they were basically the people, not completely, but two of them were kids in the first movie. So like, there was an 11-year-old boy in the first movie, Mark Trombino, who was 11, and now he's 31 in the second movie. And so it was really interesting to see. I of course I reprised some of the footage that was in the original film, so it was sort of a then and now kind of thing. And it was really interesting to me to just juxtapose who they were then and how they saw what aspirations they had for their future and who they thought they would be in 20 years. And then you could see how they turned out. And some of them had families. Like there was one couple who was in the first film. Actually, only the husband of the couple was in the first film, but in the second film, he and his wife are in it. They have a dwarf daughter who's in her like maybe 19 and an average sized son. So from an encyclopedic point of view, like there was another young girl who was 16 in the first film, and in the second film, she's married to an average sized man. And then there's another couple who has two dwarf kids. So like I hit every permutation, just, if there's such a thing of central casting in documentary.
You're like, I got them all.
Yeah, because, these are the things that the average size audience is curious about. Oh, well, do dwarf couples have dwarf kids? And, sometimes yes, and sometimes no, there's genetics involved. And so anyway, those were two of my films. And I think, pretty important films for me personally, because like you said, in terms of, how Drive-In Blues sort of, left some sort of imprint on you. I think people who have seen the films, it's eye-opening for people who maybe have never met a little person or thought about what it is to, live life as a dwarf, or thought about, how we in our culture are so busy othering people and marginalizing people. It's a way to make people think about that without it being explicit. Like none of my films have narration. They're not preachy. They're really just like based on the human story. Like that's how I look at them. If you can connect to people emotionally in the films, then that's the takeaway. And so stylistically, although the films formally are pretty different, I really haven't had narration in any of my films except for one personal film I made about sexual violence against women. And that was a film called In Harm's Way. I made another film about women and body image called Mirror, Mirror. And now this new film I'm working on sort of deals about like socialization of like sort of all the instructional films that women of my generation were exposed to in terms of how we were supposed to behave and live our lives and everything. And that's going to be like a crazy mashup. And, I'm going to have fun with that one. Yeah.
I mean, we are a magnet for creatives, and I know that our audience is made up of nonstop creatives. That's why we love going into the backstory of what inspires somebody, what leads them on their path and all that stuff. But why don't you tell us, I mean, so many of these people listening would die for a career that spans as long as yours has. Has your process changed? I mean, obviously the technology has shifted, but has your process and approach changed at all over the years?
That's a great question. Yes, the technology has changed, but interestingly, because I take so long to make every film, and I take a little breather between films. Actually, all of my films were shot on 16 millimeter, except my most recent film, which was a film called Perfect Strangers, which was a film about an altruistic kidney donor, someone who decided to give away a kidney but had to find someone who needed one, which is again, like, why would I make a film like that? Because to me, it's partly about organ donation, but it's really more about altruism. And by looking at this one woman's story, I hope that the viewer would sort of think about their own life and where are they on this continuum of altruism and what choices have they made in their own lives without it being explicit. It's not, there's no bullet points or text this number at the end if you want to donate a kidney, But really, I want people to be a little bit unsettled as they watch the film, thinking, oh my gosh, like what if a sibling asked me for a kidney? Like, is this something I could do? And of course, that is what happens when people watch the film. So that one, of course, was shot digitally, not of course, but it was because the shoot was it took me 3 years to shoot it because the story took that long. So we started shooting in 2010 and finished shooting when she finally donated her kidney in 2013. And the film came out in 2014. So the one thing that I have not changed at all in my process is the size of the crew. So I always do my own sound recording, and I work with a cinematographer. It's been different people over the years. The last 2 films have been shot. I hired former students, actually. I teach at Stanford in an MFA program, and I've taught there for 30 years. And so I've hired former students, once they've been out a few years. And so for
oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, so for Perfect Strangers, I worked with this woman named Charlene Music, and for Big Enough, the second Little People film, I worked with a cinematographer named Fern Perlstein, who's based in New York, and she had been my student maybe 6 or 7 years earlier. So we're always a 2-person crew. I mean, I think the way you, as documentarians, the way people enter people's lives is really important. And I think you can sort of infer what the relationship is between filmmaker and subject when you look at a film. And to me, it's like except for the drive-in film, I have to say that is the exception. With that film, just logistically, I did have to start filming with people right when I met them, right? Because there wasn't really, I didn't have the time, and they were very busy too. So, but with most of my films, I try to create relationships first. So with Little People, my co-director and I met a number of the people who we filmed in the summer of 1981. We met them a year earlier when we went to the Little People of America National Convention, and, met them, heard their stories, maintained a relationship over the next year while we looked for funding for the film. And certainly with like Perfect Strangers, the woman who donated her kidney, I met her. It took me about a year to decide to make that film because, I'm always looking for, does this want to be a film is a question I always ask. Like sometimes, like my students will pitch an idea and it will be based on an article they read. And I say, okay, well, that was an interesting article, but why does it want to be a film? So for me, I'm always looking for a visual angle. I don't want just people talking through a film or, I want the scenes to sort of speak for themselves, as hopefully they do in Drive-In Blues and some of my other films. So that's always a criterion too. The small crew, the relationships, and, sort of the visual potential of the film. And then, stylistically, they have been different. I mean, I think the first significant film I actually made while I was in grad school. It's a film called Sticks. It's a 10-minute nonverbal. It has a sound design, but it's people's behavior on the subway. And it's sort of got an experimental sound design.
Yeah.
And, it did quite well. It was distributed by the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And I still really like that film. I mean, I shot it in 1976. It was released in 1976, but, I show it to my students now, and I think it really still holds up because it's really like very experiential. Like when you watch the film, you just feel like you're there with the people on the subway and you're experiencing what they're experiencing. So that was a really formative experience for me the whole time I was editing that film, it was like, what I'm doing in this film couldn't be done in print, or it couldn't be done in still photography, and so that's a really high bar.
It begs to be a movie.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It's a really high bar to me to say, does this want to be a movie, and could I achieve the same end in any other medium? And if the answer is yes, then it doesn't want to be a movie.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, one of the true blessings of our journey here is, we've become a little bit of an inspiration for future drive-in owners and other owners across the country. But again, going back to the fact that we have so many filmmakers and creatives listening, if you could give advice to those people that are kind of wanting to jump off and wanting to make something, where do you point them as far as finding that inspiration to just do it?
I would point them to themselves. I mean, I just feel like the films that really make it in the world are the films that the filmmakers believe in. And, if the filmmaker, him or herself, doesn't feel passionate about the idea, I think that shows up, in the end product. So I remember when I was in graduate school, or even, out of school, I've met people over the years. I've met documentarians over the years who are trying to second guess, like what's fundable, what's the next flavor of the month. And it would always really amaze me that people would do what you have to do to make a film, just to game the system, not really something because they they somehow attached themselves to the theme of the film or felt like this was something they wanted to share with other people. So I think that's, a really important criterion. And then the second thing is, I think, and this is just the bane of, where we are with technology, a problem that, and I've really seen a sea change in my students, like having taught for so many years. I think the problem with digital technology is, talk is cheap, as it were. Like when for me, who was trained in film, and when I was training people in film, people were much more considered as filmmakers. They really had to think before they, turned on the cash register, as it was, like 16 millimeter cameras were like cash registers, right? They're like burning through. I mean, that's how I think about it. Film was expensive, and processing was expensive. And everyone's like all excited about, isn't this great that you can make movies on your cell phones? And I think it is great. And yes, it has democratized the medium. And yes, everybody can be a filmmaker, but the downside is, I think everybody can be a filmmaker, but it sort of takes away this idea of, but wait a minute, you still have to learn how to be a filmmaker. I mean, just because you have the tool to do it, I mean, someone could give me a scalpel, but that doesn't mean I can do open heart surgery, right? And there is sort of this callous, like, oh, well, I own an iPhone, so I'm going to make a movie. But, there's a lot more that goes into it. And I think people—
It's almost too accessible.
Exactly. And people overshoot. And, there's sort of sometimes this idea of, well, I don't really know what I want the film to be about, but I'll figure it out in the editing room. And that just feels like I always see that not work. Like I can always tell when like one of my students pitches an idea that you can really tell that they can't see. Like I always ask them, can you see what this film will be in 4 months from now when you're looking at it on the screen with other people? And if they, if they can see that, then it helps put them blinders on. So when you're out in the world and there's just like this surfeit of things that one can shoot, it helps you like not use the camera like a fire hose, it helps you
can focus that power.
Yeah. It helps oh, this scene is relevant to my film. I'm going to film this, and this one isn't. You just sort of have to stay the course, which is not to say, you shouldn't be nimble as a filmmaker. And when unexpected things start to happen that are related to what you're making the film about, of course you should, include them. But I do feel, I go to film festivals where people sort of get up and say, oh, we shot 500 hours for this 1 hour film. And, they sort of say it like it's a badge of honor.
Right.
And I just feel like, wow, like who would ever admit that? That's terrible.
Does your editor still talk to you?
I'm my own editor.
That's what I'm just saying. If you shoot 500 hours, and here you go,
right.
Who's working with you?
Oh, that's right. And they'll even say, oh, it took my editor 7 months to just watch the material. Yeah, Jesus. But I'm my own editor. So right. And maybe that's why
that's the way to play.
I'm so militant about, not overshooting, because I'm my own editor. So why would I subject myself to all of these rushes that have nothing to do with the film?
Absolutely. I can really relate on that shift, when things all went digital. As you know, we're the only drive-in running 35 millimeter film still full time. And, one of the things that was lost in that big digital shift was the art of projection and working with film and kind of adding that element to the movie going experience. And in a weird way, as much as we're preserving the drive-in and 35 millimeter film, we're also preserving the need and art form of projection.
That's great. Yeah. And so what do you think would be lost if you switched to, digital projection?
I mean, again, I've ran indoor movie theaters, and the big difference with the indoor market now is you're truly renting a seat. You're going in, the minimal face-to-face experience with people. It's insanely sanitized. And when it comes to the presentation, the move now is the crispest, cleanest presentation out there, and just like our love of vinyl records and the sound of vinyl records, there really is a feel and a difference when it comes to a lived-in 35 millimeter print that has, made the rounds across the country. And I think that's something that truly is lost if we were to make the shift, beyond the fact that, if there weren't places like us that were doing this, 35 millimeter does become a dead medium. Projection does become a lost art. So that's the thing I'm so proud of at the Mahoning, is that it truly is a preservation house as well as a functioning, thriving museum.
None of that's to say that we're trying to show bad prints. We're as thrilled as anybody is when we get a pristine print that we can.
Oh, absolutely.
Like opening weekend. A lot of it too is, we welcome people into the projection booth to see how it works. And people are amazed, number one, that they can go in the projection booth, but just to see how for us it worked, and for how so many years it worked with the 2 projectors and reel changes and all of that. And and not even thinking about it. People are thrilled when we say, do you want to hold a reel of this film that's your favorite film of all time? And to physically hold, what will be projected that night is something that most people never had the chance to experience before. So
that's so great. Do you use a platter system, or do you really still have them on reels?
It's the reels.
Reel to reel. Yeah.
So many studios and collectors don't want their prints going on the platter system where you have to cut the heads and the tails off. So in order to get prints at all, we have to be reels. We were platters for a good number of years, but just before I think we went retro, we went back to the 2 projectors.
Oh, that's so great. Well, where I live in Palo Alto, there's David Packard of Hewlett-Packard fame is a real film buff, and he's been working with the UCLA Film Archive to restore a lot of their prints. And so then they show them in 35 millimeter at this downtown movie theater that he restored. And as you said, and they have an organ too that comes up at intermission.
I love it.
Out of the bowels of the theater there. Beautiful. It's pretty terrific.
I'll tell you. Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. And again, a passion, it's something that when we jumped into this, it was purely, we love drive-ins. We want to do everything we can to help our local drive-in, and the natural shift of the industry and what we went through. It's been a real ride for sure.
Well, it's great that you 2 are doing that. I think it's really, it's just what I was saying earlier. It's like, the culture is disposable, and obviously you 2 are not regarding it in that way.
That's right.
That's right. Of that, which is great.
Well, I had a few more questions for you relating back to drive-in blues. Of the drive-ins that you visited in the documentary, have any survived, I guess, besides Shankweiler's?
I think the Mansfield Drive-In, the one where the owner built the multiple screens, is still in business.
Beautiful.
I'm quite sure. I know the Mr. Stone is gone, and the one in East Texas with Mother Son is gone. I don't know about the Colorado one, the Monte Vista Drive-In.
I think
the
that's
hotel
still there.
one.
I think one of our regulars has sent photos from that. I want to say maybe it's
beautiful.
Maybe the motel is now a Best Western or something, but I know there is a Colorado motel, hotel / drive-in still in operation.
Oh, that's great. Okay, yeah. So 1 out of 3. I mean, those are the 3 that I sort of dealt with in depth in terms of interviewing the owners and all that. Some of the others, like the Granbury Drive-In, some of them I just went and did some stills because the interviews just didn't add too much to what other people said. So yeah, I would say probably maybe a third are still in business, or maybe less.
I was curious for people who will hear this and see it and say, hey, maybe it's something I could go and see now, 30 years later. So
the Orfield, as we talked about earlier, that one's still there, and that's in the film. There's a whole scene with that one in the film, and the Connecticut one where the screen is being built, and the motel. So actually, it seems like 50% of them are still in business.
Not too bad. Not too bad.
I guess I got lucky in my picks, right?
I'd say, yeah. Well, also in our research of your kind of journey with this movie, we came across an Entertainment Tonight clip, and the King Leonard Maltin reviewed this movie. Where did that come from? It's pretty rare that a short will be reviewed like that.
You're right. And he approached me. I have no idea. It was like, a complete over the transom. I mean, at the time I had a distributor based in LA that just distributed documentaries. But yeah, he approached me and wanted to do something on it. And, I sent him the print, and he I think there's a little clip of it.
Yeah, it's out there on YouTube. It's living. Yeah.
And you're
It's
interviewed
crazy.
in that. I used to watch Entertainment Tonight, as a movie obsessed kid regularly, and it was unusual, as Virgil said, for him for Leonard Maltin to review a documentary or a documentary short, but also to have a little interview with the filmmaker. That was just really, really interesting to see as a nice little time capsule.
Well, I guess maybe he was interested in the film because it was a film about films, right? It was a film about theaters. So
Len's a drive-in fan.
Yeah, I imagine that was the hook.
Well, this has been amazing. Mark, do you have any other questions for Jan?
The one thing I wanted to point out that we haven't mentioned yet in this discussion is that Jan is coming to us from Austria right now. And you have the record, and probably will maintain the record. We'll send you the big gold belt in the mail of the person we've spoken to farthest away. And also one of the best sound qualities we've had from anybody. So apparently the key is to speak.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
Speak to somebody on the other side of the world, and it sounds great.
Well, I'm just sitting here on my laptop, only 6 hours away from you. Of course, I'm 9 hours away from my home in California.
Right.
So this is 6 hours. Seems like around the corner, but yeah. So I'm here in Austria as a Fulbright scholar, and I'm actually teaching two courses, but one of them is called America Viewed, and it's looking at a lot of American issues through the lens of documentary films. So I get to
that's
show
beautiful.
a whole lot of documentary films, and we're talking about just everything that's so different from their experience. I'm in a town called Graz, which is the second largest town in Austria, but it's only 300,000 people. It's interesting because right now there's an Austrian film festival going on called Diagonale. It's an annual festival just of Austrian films. And today I went to a couple documentaries, that are about Austria, and it really gave me an appreciation of what my students here experiences of watching the films that I'm sharing with them, because, it's really different than teaching these same films back at Stanford, where I can know the baggage that the American students bring to the films that I'm showing them. But here I can't make those assumptions. And so not only are we talking about the filmmaking and film issues and making them more visually literate, but also talking much more about the contents of the film, whether it's, Black Lives Matter or gun control or economic disparity. I mean, pretty much anything I introduce is new and fresh, and they're writing response papers. And so I'm learning a lot from them in terms of how they're responding to the films and the things that engage them or confuse them or, surprise them. So it's been I've only been here 5-6 weeks so far. It's a semester long thing. So I'll be here till the end of June.
Sounds like quite an experience.
Yeah, the other course I'm teaching is a photography course where they're going out and shooting stuff every week. So that's pretty exciting too.
That's beautiful. Well, again, we can't thank you enough. Why don't you let the listeners know where they can find information on you or purchase the works?
Yeah, sure. So I do sell drive-in blues. It's like $22.99 or something like that, including postage. Off my website, all my films are available on my website, which is just my name, jankrawitz.com. And all my films are there with trailers on each and synopsis and press and everything else about me.
Thank you for making this movie. Again, it's touched the lives of so many, but it again ignited that love, that attention, that light shined on the drive-in at the perfect time. And again, inspired some people and led them on their paths. Right, Mark?
That's true of me, at least.
Well, thanks.
Absolutely.
I feel like you two are kindred spirits. So I'm glad we were able to connect in this podcast.
Absolutely.
This is great.
When you're back home in California, when me and Mark make the off-season trip, we're going to come out and see you and we'll get some lunch.
Well, that sounds great. Now, tell me exactly where the Mahoning is located.
We're in Lehighton, Pennsylvania, which is a little bit above Allentown, or if you're thinking about in terms of Shankweiler's, we're about a half hour north of Shanks. So, yeah. If you're ever out here on the East Coast, town
many times. So next time I come through there,
hopefully it's during the season and you can come out and see the madness.
Yeah, that would be amazing because I have relatives in Hazleton. So
come on, yeah, neighbors. I love it.
Yes.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you. Keep doing what you're doing and stay awesome.
Yeah, you two keep doing what you're doing as well. It's really terrific.
Oh, bless you. All right. On that note, Jeff, take it away, my friend.
Ladies and gentlemen, thanks again for coming out tonight to the Mahoning Drive-In Theater. We hope you'll come back and see us again real soon. The exit is on the right-hand side of the screen at the front of the field, and most importantly, have a very safe trip home. Good night and God bless you.